for negotiations on immigration. What made the meeting extraordinary is that the session, nearly an hour long, was televised. A source telling CNN that was done on purpose to counter questions about the president's fitness for office. I want to talk about the Trump presidency now with Ron Reagan Jr., the son of the former president, Ronald Reagan. He joins me via Skype. Thank you, sir, so much for joining us. We appreciate it. You know, after the explosive description of President Trump's White House from Michael Wolff and the president pouring gas on the fire, we've been having a national discussion, Ron, of mental fitness for office. What's your impression of the president's fitness for office?
I've been saying since he was nominated, perhaps even before, that this was a man who was unfit for office. This is not a psychological diagnosis. I'm not particularly interested in what pathologies he may or may not have. This is a question of character. It's a question of personality. It's not about what he has. It's about who he is. His behavior is erratic. It's impulsive. He doesn't seem to be really familiar with issues. He attacks people lower than him on the food chain, punching down. He has behaved in a way that I would describe as treasonous regarding the Russia investigation, and he may, in fact, be guilty of criminal activity. I would say that his mental status is up for question, but I don't say that as a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I'm not interested in that. I'm a human being. I can watch another human being and say there's something wrong there, and there is something wrong here.
You think the character issue is in some way worse? Because you're saying that the bigger problem for you is that you think he has character flaws and maybe there is something wrong cognitively, but that's not for you to judge. Do you think the character issue is a bigger issue?
Well, there's clearly something. I'm not concerned about, as I said, about his pathology. I'm concerned about his behavior. His behavior is troubling. It is erratic. It is impulsive. He doesn't seem to really be familiar with the job he's been called to do. He says things, he's dishonest. He says things that are untrue all the time. He claims now, all of a sudden, apparently, that that voice on the Access Hollywood tape wasn't him, even though he acknowledged earlier that it was. This is the sort of behavior that you might call delusional. And I'm not saying that as a psychiatrist, just as an observant human being.
Let me ask you about your father, because you have some experience. You may have some experience with this. Your father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's years after leaving office. But in the wake of the revelations in Wolff's book, the president compared himself to President Reagan, and he tweeted this. He said, "Now that Russian collusion, after 1 year of intense study, has proven to be a total hoax on the American public, the Democrats and their lapdogs, the fake news mainstream media, are taking out the old Ronald Reagan playbook and screaming mental stability and intelligence. Actually, throughout my life, my two greatest assets have been mental stability and being, like, really smart." What's your reaction to him making such a comparison?
Well, there's really no comparison with my father. Listen, presidents have maladies at times. Lincoln was depressed. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke. Eisenhower had heart attacks. Kennedy had Addison's disease. Richard Nixon, who's probably the closest analog to Trump, apparently in the throes of Watergate, was becoming somewhat unhinged, according to people who were around him. My father was diagnosed in 1994 with Alzheimer's-related dementia. I mentioned, and other people have mentioned, that in the later stages of his presidency, he seemed to be struggling a little bit with short-term memory lapses and things like that. Could that have been a result of the early stages of Alzheimer's? Possibly, because we now know as a medical fact that if you are, that dementia, a late-stage symptom of Alzheimer's, emerges after about 10 years with the disease. Simple math tells you then that he must have had the disease in its early stages when he was president. But that's an entirely different thing than what we're witnessing right now. President Trump came to office unfit. He did not develop a malady at some point that rendered him unfit. He is characterologically, if not pathologically, unfit. Yeah. And that is apparent for all to see. I know this is a difficult discussion for the country to have. We're not used to talking about presidents this way, and it makes us all a little bit uncomfortable. But we have to get used to, I think, the reality of what is happening and face it forthrightly. This is not a normal man, a normal president in this White House now, and it's a danger to the nation.
Well, I think it's interesting because when it comes to, I'm not saying that this president has any of those symptoms or if he's, dementia or whatever his fitness is, but when it comes to mental issues, we have such a stigma with those issues. And I think as Americans, as people, we should take that stigma off and we should be able to discuss these issues. Just as you said, it is uncomfortable, but it doesn't have to be uncomfortable. And I'm glad you said what you said because many raise questions about your father's acuity. When he was in office. And this is an op-ed. It's on CNN.com, the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, as well as an author of 4 books on your father. He says that he underwent a psychological and physical testing every year he was in office, and doctors never found any sign of mental deterioration. But did you ever see signs that might have been early indicators of Alzheimer's?
When we headed into his second term, I noticed that he, to me, and I'm somebody, of course, who knew him extremely well, he just seemed slightly slower than he used to be. But remember, this was a man in his mid-70s by that point. He'd been shot and nearly killed. It would not be surprising if he was just slowing down a little bit. But he did not have dementia while he was in office. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump has dementia. Again, that's a medical determination.
Right.
I'm not qualified, nor are you, to make that sort of determination. Frankly, again, I don't care if he has some sort of malady or pathology. I'm not worried about that. I'm concerned with his behavior, how this man is acting, and he is not acting like a normal, grown-up president of the United States.
Your father underwent psychological testing, as I just said in the question before. Every year. You don't believe?
No, I don't. No, he had a physical every year, but I don't think that psychological tests were given to him every year. I never heard that.
So the Reagan Library says that, but you don't think that every year he.
This is the first I've heard of that.
Yeah. Do you think every president should undergo a physical and psychological testing when they're in office?
Well, it'd be a good idea to have a physical every year. I think we get into some troubling territory, though, when you start talking about psychological examination. Who's going to perform that psychological examination? They have a duty to protect the privacy of a patient. In that case, as a psychologist, what should they divulge about a person's psyche? Again, I don't want to make this a psychiatric issue with Donald Trump. It is a behavioral issue.
A lot of talk today about building the wall and about dreamers. How would your father, you think, have treated these issues, Ron?
Well, when he was governor of California, my father signed what amounted to an amnesty law, which legalized many of the undocumented workers who were picking a lot of fruit and lettuce and things in California and vital to the economy there. I suspect he probably would have done the same thing. There was not a racist bone in my father's body. We cannot say the same for Mr. Trump. He is fond of characterizing people in terms of their ethnic heritage and race and excusing white supremacy and the like. That's not at all my father.
I have to ask you about the talk of a possible run by none other than you-know-who, Oprah, in 2020. With all the chaos of the Trump administration, another celebrity, you think, is that the answer for Democrats?
I have nothing against Oprah. She's a very intelligent and successful woman. I'm sure that she could handle the job much better than our current celebrity president is doing. But I think it would be a mistake for Democrats or really any political party to assume that just because Donald Trump lucked his way into the White House, that it's a good idea to start electing as president people who really have no experience in governing or governance.
Well, listen, last but not least, Steve Bannon resigned as executive chairman of Breitbart News today. They say he resigned. Some say he was fired. Apparently shoved out after his comments to Michael Wolff. The mighty have fallen. How the mighty have fallen. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are that Steve Bannon was really never as mighty as people thought he was. Steve Bannon doesn't strike me as a particularly bright guy, and the fact that he was, hanging around with a guy like Donald Trump doesn't say much for him either. So I was never terribly impressed by Steve Bannon.